guys could just talk also on this topic. My name is Dean. I grew up on the island of Maui. I'm a UH major. I majored in ethnic studies. I currently live in New York City where I teach. And I wrote a book called Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood, which I'm going to be talking about today. So actually rewrote this talk, because usually I actually present other kinds of material. But because it's the Hui Aloha Aina o Honolulu that invited me, I wanted to highlight some of the material that I was able to find that hopefully would be more relevant. On the 4th of July in 1960, the state of Hawaii held a flag ceremony here on the grounds of Iolani Palace, where they replaced the recently changed U.S. flag that had 49 stars with a new U.S. flag that had 50 stars. And so this program was a reenactment of the flag ceremony held on August 12, 1898. So when the Hawaiian national flag was lowered and the U.S. flag was raised. And so in a press release for the 1960 event, organizers of the flag ceremony referred to Iolani Palace as a, quote, scene of both great happiness and sorrow throughout the history of Hawaii. The sorrow mentioned includes the 1898 flag ceremony, which is widely remembered as a moment when Kanaka Uiwi, who were present, publicly grieved over the occupation of their nation. So Noenoe Silva writes that the three hui who collected signatures comprising the Ku'e petitions opposing annexation, the Hui Kalai Aina, Hui Aloha Aina, and the Hui Aloha Aina o Nā Wahine, boycotted this ceremony, and still the flag ceremony made U.S. officials nervous enough that they called for U.S. troops to flank the palace. Kathleen Dickinson Mellon, anybody know who Kathleen Dickinson Mellon is? So she wrote 4 books in the 1940s and 1950s narrating the overthrow of the Hawaiian nation, and she wrote those histories as a means of opposing statehood. Her second book was also, which is about Kahumanu, was potentially going to be turned into a movie. So she was actually somebody who a lot of people in Hawaii knew. And when she passes away, her obituary is actually on the front page of both the Honolulu Star-Bulletin and Honolulu Advertiser. So she was sort of known as an unruly woman, but also as a kind of radical historian, right? So she writes, and she quotes an American reporter as describing the 1898 flag ceremony as having, quote, the tension of an execution. Okay, so this is where we are today. And so in 1960, Iolani Palace serves as a backdrop for the settler state, welcoming U.S. statehood by reenacting the alleged annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Such theatrics would seemingly settle the wrongs that had been committed by the United States. And so prior to the event, Hawaiian Lieutenant Governor James K. Aloha put out a call asking for those who were in attendance at the first flag ceremony in 1898 to participate as special guests of the new state. So one of the 3 sailors who raised the U.S. flag at the 1898 ceremony was eager to attend, as were some of the children of the legislators of the provisional government. A Chinese woman named Ho Fo Chung expressed the desire to attend, but was less celebratory of the actual day in 1898. She explained that she, quote, witnessed the lowering of the Hawaiian flag slowly, during which the middle-aged and the elderly Hawaiian women wept with their heads bowed. And so in Governor William Quinn's speech, he talks about the relationship between Hawaii U.S. statehood, or admission of Hawaii as a state, and anti-colonial movements for independence. Quinn argued that the admission of Hawaii as a U.S. state should serve as inspiration for nationalist movements aiming for decolonization. And so, quote, the nations which have thrown off the yoke of colonialism in the past 15 years have an inevitable pattern which they must follow if they would have the success with their independence that we have had with ours. Free men should be working men who are raising their standard of living and shaping the economic stability of their country. The 50th star stands for a place where peoples of every nationality and culture have learned to live in harmony with each other. Now it is our task to show the rest of the world that any community or country can prosper regardless of the racial ancestry of the people who comprise it. So this is during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state allowed for a place rich in diversity to serve as a non-white face for U.S. imperialism. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the talk. But this kind of discourse, this narrative manifested as the establishment of US military bases globally. Okay, so currently, we have 800 military bases that are outside of the United States, right, which makes the United States the largest militarized empire in world history. Okay. So this opinion campaign was designed by a man named Edward Bernays and allowed for US occupation to be recoded in the language of anti-racism and decolonization. And arguing Hawaii's admission as a US state to be a quote-unquote success with independence, Quinn referenced Cold War hotspots such as the Republic of Congo and the Philippines, saying that US capitalism and democracy all bring economic stability and are a quote-unquote must for newly decolonized nations. Quinn made these statements despite the fact that US statehood occurred in Hawaii not because of economic stability, but because of numerous rounds of economic crises. So these crises in the 1870s, 1890s, 1930s, and the 1940s were strung together through a fail-forward logic that viewed the US occupation of Hawaii as a resolution to crises of capitalism. And I'll explain that throughout the talk, right? So tonight's talk, I wish to argue that statehood was neither the result of the United States gifting democracy to little islands in the Pacific, nor is it the result of a strong nation swallowing a weak and feeble island nation, but rather statehood is the result of a series of economic depressions, a weakening US nation whose mode of production, capitalism, was increasingly unsustainable without enacting a more aggressive policy of imperialism. So if we think of forms of US occupation and settler colonialism as emerging from positions of weakness, not strength, we gain a more accurate understanding of how the United States came to occupy Hawaii. So as such, settler colonialism fails forward into its various imperial formations, including what is intimately known as statehood. So basically what I'm trying to say is that capitalism is unsustainable as an economic system. Right? It's never been sustainable, and capitalism has only sustained itself by encroaching and seizing indigenous lands. That's how the United States came into existence in the very beginning. And it also occurs from its very beginning, from its inceptions in the 17th century by displacing European peoples throughout the world, right? So if Europe was so happening, why did so many Europeans have to leave Europe, right? And I feel like I learned that history a lot more clearly after living in New York City, when you actually see the white ethnic enclaves of the people who are displaced from Europe, right? So only 10 months after helping to lead the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Lauren Thurston was at the 1893 Columbian Exposition. So Thurston, a third-generation settler of some of the first American missionaries to Hawaii, was managing his Kilauea cyclorama, which is a 5-story high and 400-foot wide landscape painting of Kilauea volcano, designed to encircle the viewer and give the impression of standing in the actual crater. So placing large American flags at the top of the cyclorama, and remember Hawaii is still independent in this moment, right? Thurston used his cyclorama as an advertisement for tourism and annexation. So for annexationists, Hawaii needed to be seen not as an internationally recognized nation, which had been since 1843 with foreign delegates throughout the world, but instead as a primitive and exotic place, a place to be made anew with the joint help of white settlers from Hawaii and the newly industrialized United States, so sort of how Hawaii is seen today. And so with more than 27 million visitors, the exposition was used to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas, and narrated the conquest of Native Americans and the settlement of their land as evidence of white superiority. So U.S. claims of white racial superiority, however, occurred during a time when its economic dominance appeared most threatened. So that's to say that a global celebration of white supremacy, the exposition was popularly referred to as the White City, existed in a moment when the U.S. economy was on the verge of collapse. So the U.S. nation's economy by 1893 was in a major depression with 500 banks closed, 15,000 companies shut down, and by the middle of 1894, a record 4 million people were unemployed. This economic depression created numerous radical movements, populist movements, which argued that capitalism was a system that benefited the rich at the expense of the poor, and were thus calling for revolution. Okay. So historian Walter Lefebvre explains that the Harrison administration's support of white settlers in Hawaii overthrowing the Hawaiian nation was a product of what Lefebvre calls depression diplomacy. So where the United States was in an economic depression and deemed the securing of overseas markets, specifically in China, as a necessity to alleviating the glut of industrial goods. So basically, the North had all of these industrial goods. They needed to figure out where they were going to sell it to, right? And so they viewed Hawaii, especially in this moment, but later on they'll view the Philippines, Guam, Samoa as stepping stones to markets in China. And so the Columbian Exposition was divided into two main sections. So the Midway Plaisance, which is right here, which is a 2-mile strip that led to the White City. So actually where the University of Chicago currently is where the current Midway Plaisance was, or is where the Midway Plaisance was. And it led to the White City and basically told a story about the benefits of white civilization's conquest of the non-white world. So the planners of the Columbian Exposition found synergy between the story expressed at their fair and the events taking place in Hawaii. So in preparation for the opening day of the exposition, the Chicago Tribune suggested hoisting the same American flag above the exposition's grand entrance that had been flown over the Hawaiian government building during the overthrow. And they opined that, quote, such a gesture would, quote, advertise the cause of annexation and once more bring it home to the minds and hearts of all Americans. And so most of the non-Western world was placed on exhibit at the Midway. And Smithsonian ethnologist Otis Tufton Mason identified 3 modern types of savagery: the American or Native Americans, the Negroid or African Americans, and this third, which was a new category that they developed, which was called the Maleo-Polynesian. And so these groups were all said to be at the very beginning stages of human progress. The latter category, Maleo-Polynesian, laid the groundwork for U.S. colonial projects in Hawaii, Samoa, Guam, and a genocidal war and occupation of the Philippines, where upwards of 2 million Filipinos were killed so that the Americans could teach Filipinos to be democratic. And so the similarities between white settler claims over Native American and Hawaiian lands were not lost on Kanaka Uiwi or Native Americans, and in a letter to Queen Liliuokalani, the, quote, the citizens of the Cherokee Nation inquired, quote, how many volunteer Americans would it require to reestablish your Majesty's government and displace the oligarchy that usurps your country? Some Kanaka Uiwi were further aware of the commonality of their struggle with Filipinos against the United States, and in 1899, Robert Wilcox, the Hawaiian nationalist who led armed revolts to restore the Hawaiian nation, wrote 2 letters to Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippine War against the United States, to express solidarity with the Filipino fight for independence and to offer his services. Actually, we should ask Kim Kompak about this. I think her research has actually filled this out more. And so the racist idea that darker races needed to catch up to whiter ones was visually expressed at the Midway and based their location according to their proximity to capitalism, where groups are arranged with savage races representative of people who created land-based economies on the far left of the Midway, Oriental races in the middle, and ethnic whites, or the Germans, the Irish, etc., who were closest to the White City. And so basically the way they arranged it was based on what kind of economy these populations were able to create, right? Were they able to create currency and capitalism and markets, or were they reliant on a kind of land-based economy, right? More like indigenous economies. And so if you were using a land-based economy, they mark you as prominent, right? I have a lot to say about that. But the location of the Kilauea cyclorama placed Kanaka Uiwi between the American Indian Show and the exhibit on Algeria and Tunisia. And the White City contained enormous Olympian structures that symbolize a kind of future wish, a glorious future only achievable by maintaining status quo. And so this was meant to keep the white working class in check, especially those who are calling for revolution. And ironically, the White City was eventually burned down by the white working class. And these are most likely those who were involved in the Pullman strikes, the railroad strikes at the time. And so while others have written about the use of exposition to discipline the white working class, this future wish also created a sinister expectation that native peoples would die off. So historian Michael Addis writes about frontier regions throughout the world, quote, terms like primitive and savage came to signify sorry past and tragic futures that would ultimately end with their cultural and perhaps biological extinction. And the ironic thing about the Columbian Exposition is even though they're talking about white supremacy and white superiority and this kind of civilizational order that the Columbian Exposition symbolized, the Potawatomi, the indigenous peoples of Chicago, were always present at public events and called out the mayor for having not paid the Potawatomi for the lands that they were currently on. And you actually have Simon Pokagon, who was one of the leaders of the Potawatomi bands, who wrote a book. And he wrote a book and he actually writes about the red man's greetings. And he basically said, we would rather celebrate our own funerals than invite and celebrate the world to participate in the Columbian Exposition. And so, quote-unquote, Orientals, as opposed to quote-unquote primitives, were not savage peoples at the beginning of progress, but at the fair, they were viewed as the measures of progress, right? Between traditional and modern, but modern always meaning Western. The Japanese government, which was described as having made greater strides toward, quote, the Western spirit of enterprise and civilization, was given a space for display apart from the Midway, and instead they were located in the White City itself. And the reason for this was the Japanese were imagined to have the capability of opening Asia to capitalism. And thus they would allow Asia and the much needed markets that would help get the United States out of economic depression. And so historian Eiichiro Azuma explains that the Meiji government understood that in order to be considered a quote-unquote civilized nation, Japan would have to, quote, partake in the practice of colonization. And the Meiji state's colonization of the Ainu and Hokkaido in 1869 was modeled after the white settler conquest of Native Americans. Japan would establish their own form of manifest destiny by colonizing Okinawa, Taiwan, northern China, Korea, and eventually the Philippines and other Pacific islands, including Guam. And so as an advertisement for tourism and annexation, Thurston's Kilauea cyclorama represented Hawaii as a place where American civilization and native savagery met. And this was in keeping in line with the idea that primitives, quote unquote, were at the very beginning of human progress, and thus Hawaii, as represented through Kilauea, or a volcano, was viewed as a geological symbol of the absolute beginning stages of development, a place on Earth at its most primitive state. And at the same time, it was done through the most modern form of Western technological entertainment in existence, the cyclorama. So cycloramas were considered all the rage in America, and they're also the predecessor to motion picture film. And so the way this kind of worked is that Lauren Thurston actually creates the aesthetic. Like he creates the image of Hawaii. So if you look at advertisements in Hawaii, they're not just selling Hawaii as a place that is timeless. They're also selling Hawaii as a place that has all of the amenities of civilization. And so it's that juxtaposition of savagery and modernity, of luxury, that is developed here in the cyclorama. And so the volcano, or Pele, created a sense of primitive danger, and Pele was described as a goddess of fire, and was as crucial to providing an explicitly superstitious native female threat. So Pele's statue stood above the entrance to Thurston's cyclorama, and at 25 feet, it was the second largest statue at the Columbian Exposition. In an 1893 booklet on the Midway, Pele's statue was described as, quote, her hair is blown wildly back, and there is a terrible frown upon her beautiful face, as she prepared to annihilate her enemies. And Pele's enemies, as narrated in the superficial stories told in the cyclorama, were always men. And so in a landscape painting of Kilauea Crater, Chicago painter Walter Burridge painted a geologist walking and studying within the crater. You can see him right here. It might be a little bit hard to see, but on this bottom image is a painting of a geologist. And so as a people who are seen as having a more advanced knowledge of the crater, settlers could argue that they were more deserved over that space. And so Thurston and his geologists often spoke of geology as a war between civilization and this destructive female power of Pele. So Thomas Jagger was one of the early geologists in Hawaii, was funded by Thurston, and he eventually names his book Volcanoes Declare War, in which he writes about his and Thurston's involvement in the 1935 U.S. Army's dropping of 6 tons of bombs on the lava flow from Mauna Loa. And so as opposed to the simple and one-dimensional portrayals of Pele and the cyclorama, Kanaka-Uiwi stories describe Pele's actions very differently. So no civil rights. Quote, the women in the epic engage in meaningful and pleasurable activities. They fight off evil, outsmart rapists, chant and dance hula, surf, practice medicine and religion, and have loves and profound relationships, especially with each other. They are not cooking, cleaning house, or worrying about husbands. They are not domesticated, rather they are adventurous. And so the portrayal of Pele in the cyclorama, which demanded the control of an uncontrollable and belligerent native woman, links tightly with the narration of the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in January of 1893. So Thurston described Liliuokalani in his autobiography as a quote-unquote dangerous woman who was overthrown for attempting to promulgate a new constitution, one that would restore a system of checks and balances and full political vote to Kanaka-Uiwi. And so for this, Queen Liliuokalani was characterized as dangerous to American lives and property, which seemingly justified the landing of U.S. Marines to occupy Hawaii. And so at this time, Thurston and others spread the idea that Hawaiians belonged to a primitive past, and the new settler state was Hawaii's future. And they used the language of death in order to do so. And so the idea of the death of the Hawaiian kingdom and the birth of the new settler government was repeatedly talked about by Laurent Thurston, where he argued that once Kanaka-Uiwi understood that the monarchy was dead, and quote, this idea penetrates the skulls of the great unwashed electorate, Kanaka-Uiwi would themselves become annexationists. And so Palestinian scholar Edward Said argues in a book called The Question of Palestine, where he says, and I think this is just the best definition of settler colonialism, where he says, the settler project seeks to, quote, cancel and transcend an actual reality by means of a future wish, the land be made empty for development by a more deserving power. Right? So I'll just say it again. I feel like it's a little bit dense, but he's saying, the settler project seeks to cancel and transcend an actual reality by means of a future wish, that the land be empty for development by a more deserving power. And so this future wish can be found in the Republic of Hawaii seal, which was designed by a man named Viggo Jacobson in an art competition held by the legislature of the Republic of Hawaii in 1895. And the seal continues, as you all know, to be used today by the state of Hawaii. And in a 1979 issue of Aloha magazine, they write that the seal is a modified version of the royal coat of arms of the Hawaiian kingdom. And the rising sun here replaces the royal crown and Maltese cross of the original coat of arms. It signifies the birth of a new state. King Kamehameha the Great and Goddess of Liberty, holding the Hawaiian flag, replaced 2 warriors on the royal coat of arms. Taibo ball and stick in the 2nd and 3rd quarters was carried before the king and placed before the door of his home, signifying his authority and power. But here it is a symbol of the authority and power of government. The phoenix, symbol of death and resurrection, symbolizes the change from the monarchy to a freer democratic form of government. And so in 1895, 3 years before Hawaii is illegally annexed or allegedly annexed by the United States, the star at the center of the shield represented the star of Hawaii, a future wish for statehood which Viggo Jacobson wrote, quote, we hope to see ultimately placed in the banner of the United States. And so Laurent Thurston, however, was weary of statehood and along with many of his peers, hoped to keep statehood as a kind of future wish. And in 1927, Thurston stated, quote, do I object to statehood? Most assuredly not, so long as it remains an ideal, not a reality. Right? So the dominant public story, the dominant public narrative is this idea that we went from a monarchy to a democracy, right? But the opposite of democracy is not monarchy. The opposite of democracy is conspiracy. And that is how Hawaii was overthrown by the United States. Right? It was done by a conspiracy. And they attempted to create that power in the hands of few, which is not democracy. And they were able to maintain that through a territorial structure. The U.S. territorial structure allowed for that system of appointments. So it wasn't democracy that replaced the kingdom. Right? And so a serious movement for statehood would actually begin during another moment of economic depression after the U.S. stock market crash in 1929, where over 5,000 banks closed and industrial production would fall by 50%, causing an estimated 50 million people to be unemployed. Because of the economic depression, Congress passed the Jones-Costigan Act in 1934, which took away the tariffs that made Hawaii's sugar industry profitable. Okay, so Hawaii's sugar profits are now in jeopardy. Okay. And so at this time, Hawaii's Republican Party, which represented the interests of the Big Five, began to push for statehood in Congress because they were thinking that this would allow them to regain their lucrative tariffs. So basically, it was money. The incentive around those tariffs is what pushed the initial movement for statehood. And so in 1937, there would be a congressional visit to hear testimony on Hawaii statehood. And while the major newspapers, the Honolulu Star Bulletin and Honolulu Advertiser, were running articles supportive of statehood, the alternative newspapers, such as Hawaii Hochi and Voice of Labor, were asking questions about what the visiting congressmen would be allowed to see. So the Voice of Labor would write, quote, "But they will be carefully shepherded away from fields where women or children are working. They will never see the slums of Palama or River Street. They will not see the darkened rooms where aged Chinese live and raise bean sprouts in pans of water in order that they may live. They will hear of the wonderful work Palama Settlement is doing, but they will not hear how many children are infected with syphilis, how many are illiterate, how many have to work to contribute to the support of their families while still of school age. We don't believe that they will know of these things when they leave, but we hope they do." And so the 1935 statehood hearings is historically significant because never before had so many courageously testified in opposition to the Big Five. And this is especially, I think, after the Massey case, right? So like this is when everybody's pretty much fed up with this kind of dual justice system that is inherently racist. And so John Ho'opale, for instance, argued that Hawaiians were opposed to statehood and that statehood was only desired by the wealthy. He argued that Hawaiians were being displaced in their own homeland, and he saw statehood as a question of, quote, the death and life of our country. He further stated that many more Hawaiians would testify, but since most worked for the Big Five, they were, quote, afraid to lose their bread and butter. So because of the public testimony, and particularly because Japan had invaded China earlier that year, the committee was weary of the large numbers of Japanese in Hawaii, and the Congressional Committee would recommend against statehood. And so when we're in 1893 and the 1930s, U.S. statehood was viewed as a response to economic depression. Statehood after World War II was desired to resolve the crisis of a growing tourism industry in order to profit off of the post-World War economic boom. So Malcolm McNaughton, a Big Five executive, stated that large banks and insurance companies were looking to invest in Hawaii, but were hesitant as long as Hawaii remained a territory. So McNaughton said in 1986 in an oral history interview, he says, quote, "We couldn't get this money, and air travel was increasing, tourism was coming, we needed this money, statehood would get it for us." So basically they wanted to invest in tourism, but none of the insurance companies or big banks were going to lend them the money. Because Hawaii was a territory, they were afraid that Hawaii would go back into martial law, potentially. And so Hawaii was considered an offshore investment. And so that's why the Big Five began to push for statehood intensely in the post-war moment. And so two of the major obstacles facing the statehood movement after World War II was that Hawaii is both non-contiguous, right, not a part of the continental United States, but more importantly, it was viewed as settled by the wrong kinds of settlers. So in order to make Hawaii's non-white population seem less foreign to congressmen, they used Hawaii's diversity to their favor. So by the 1950s, decolonization in Africa, Asia, Oceania, and Latin America was transforming an international order, and criticism of Western colonialism was popular international sentiment. So Cold War ideologues, specifically a propagandist or public relations expert named Edward Bernays, argued that Hawaii's multiracial population could help win the hearts and minds of newly decolonized nations. So Edward Bernays, if you guys ever want to watch a documentary about this guy, there's a documentary called A Century of the Self. And so he's a propagandist, and he is a person who helped increase the market for cigarette smoking by getting women to start smoking cigarettes. So one of his clients was Lucky Strike cigarettes. And he's also involved in the CIA overthrow of the Arbenz administration in Guatemala. And so 3 years before he's plotting the overthrow in Guatemala, he's in Hawaii. And he's a visiting professor at the University of Hawaii. And he's helping to design the public relations campaign for statehood. And so I can just show you this clip that pretty much sums up the story. And I hope you guys can hear it.
Aloha means both farewell and greetings, and Hawaii bids farewell to 40 years of frustration and failure in attempts to win statehood, and joyously greets its new status as a full-fledged member of the Union, its 50th state. It's a banner occasion for the islands, which will rank as the 47th state in area, midway between New Jersey and Connecticut. The United States border is now within 3,900 miles of Tokyo, land of the hula, of sugarcane and pineapple, with its polyglot population, brings a colorful culture as its heritage and contribution. Perhaps most important of all, Hawaiian statehood gives the lie to communist charges of American colonialism. The big day was a long time in coming, which means that much more to celebrate.
So that line about Hawaii statehood gives a lie to communist charges of American colonialism was one of the main reasons why Hawaii statehood was sort of viewed as valuable during the Cold War to the United States. So if they could get Hawaii to be admitted as a U.S. state, a non-white territory, then they could argue to the rest of the world that the United States is not a racist nation, even though they're practicing ongoing forms of segregation in this moment. Right? And so after World War II, statehood proponents were able to also respond to the questions of Asian American or Japanese American loyalty to the United States by pointing to the massive casualties and injuries sustained by the full 42nd and 100th Battalion. And the Statehood Commission would distribute large amounts of literature speaking of the Nisei soldiers, playing up to Cold War propaganda in the 1951 motion picture film Go for Broke. That would play a key role. I don't know if anybody has ever seen this film, but it's like a straight up propaganda film. But at the same time, it's also important to see that the ways in which, even though the Japanese are sort of imagined as, so basically prior to the war, a U.S. identity was primarily organized around this idea that they are not Japanese, right? Anti-Japanese racism. But after the war, especially when they're trying to mend relations between the Japanese and the United States, Japan specifically, and the United States, they needed to teach Americans that the Japanese are not our enemies anymore, but that they are potentially our friends. But the ways in which they did this was they needed to make the Japanese seem like a non-threat. They needed to make the Japanese seem palatable to a white American audience. And the ways in which they did that was through gender. They made Japanese men seem small and infantilizing compared to white men. And so this idea of like subordinate supremacy, they can be admitted into the United States or part of the United States as long as they play the role of subordinate supremacy. And so I'm just going to skip over this part because I actually do a little bit more, but I want to talk more about Kamakila Count since she's actually more relevant to the Hui Lahaina. But but I think what is important about this, about both the multicultural stuff around Edward Bernays and this film, is that portrayals of Hawaii as a racially harmonious U.S. state and selected narrations of Japanese American loyal military service were set to public memory through global circulation, amusement, and publicity, while narratives of Hawaii's occupation by the United States were designated for historical deletion. Right? So what stories are remembered? What stories do we grow up hearing in Hawaii? Right? And what stories do we not hear? Right? And how was that itself strategic? How was it actually tied to U.S. global interests in this time? And you can really see how those who spoke out about the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 1940s and 50s were very much targeted and vilified. So more than any other public figure in the 1940s, Alice Kamakila Campbell, she went publicly by the name Kamakila. She challenged the colonial assumptions that Kanaka Uivi, but particularly Kanaka Uivi women, were incapable of self-government. And so Kamakila was the daughter of Abigail Kuhilani Maipinepine Campbell, who was the president of the Hui Aloha Aina, who gathered signatures on the Ku'e petition, successfully opposing U.S. annexation in 1897. Kamakila was also the daughter of sugar planter James Campbell, which afforded her the means to speak against statehood in ways that most other Kanaka who had been dependent on the government or the Big Five for work could not. Kamakila was informed by a long matrilineal genealogy of Kanaka Uivi resistance. She was elected as the first woman territorial senator from the island of Maui. Kamakila publicized her campaign by running a radio advertisement that spoke of the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, and in this advertisement she said, quote, "To that end I shall dedicate my life." Kamakila continued the perpetuation of Hawaiian national claims during the territorial period, as her genealogy and elected political office afforded her the means and responsibility to voice the silent fears of Kanaka Uivi. Kamakila maintained that with the attainment of statehood, she said, quote, "something indefinable would be lost." And so in 1946, the first congressional hearings since the statehood hearings in 1937, these hearings were held at Iolani Palace. And knowing that Kamakila's testimony would be opposed to statehood, the Statehood Commission attempted to squeeze her into an afternoon with other witnesses. But Kamakila was determined to testify on January 17th, the date of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And Kamakila forced the committee to provide a full day of testimony for her alone. Her concerns were mainly over the monopoly of power by the Big Five and the numerical dominance of Japanese Americans. And Kamakila stated, quote, "I do not feel that we should forfeit the traditional rights and privileges of the natives of our islands for a mere thimbleful of votes in Congress. That we, the lovers of Hawaii from long association with it, should sacrifice our birthright for the greed of alien desires to remain on our shores. That we should satisfy the thirst for power and control of some inflated industrialists and politicians." And so as a member of the political and economic elite, Kamakila knew that the Big Five desired statehood to gain access to investment money for tourism. And Kamakila also called attention to the links between Big Five economic domination and the fear and silence that many harbored in opposing statehood. So she shared an example of one such sentiment sent to her in private that implored her to speak on behalf of those who could not. Quote, "We can't, Kamakila, my husband would lose his job." Those present at the hearings, however, were able to express their sentiments collectively in a thunderous cheers and applause following Kamakila's comments in a packed throne room with over 600 people in attendance. When asked by the congressman what kind of government she would want instead of statehood, Kamakila responded, quote, "an independent form of government," explaining that if others wanted to live in a U.S. state, they could simply move to any of the other 48 states in the U.S. Kamakila would, in 1948, on January 17th, again on the date of the overthrow, file a successful lawsuit in Campbell versus Steinbach et al. Against the Statehood Commission. And so the Hawaii Supreme Court would rule unanimously that taxpayer money used to advertise nationally for statehood were, quote, "to the exclusion and detriment of citizens and taxpayers opposed to statehood for Hawaii." So she actually won her lawsuit. In 1953, Kamakila would write a letter to Congress arguing that of the $475,000 appropriated for statehood since 1947, tax-paying opponents of statehood could not access these monies. Quote, "It is only fair that the opposition be heard." The Statehood Commission, indeed in 1949, had wrongly denounced a plan by Papakalea Hawaiian homesteaders to write a letter to Senator Hugh Butler opposing statehood. Homesteaders explained that they were visited by a member of the Statehood Commission who made them, quote, "afraid to make the written statement." The Hawaii Statehood Commission would also in 1957 determine ways to counter taxi drivers and tour guides who were telling tourists that statehood was not desirable amongst Kanaka Uivi. And so these instances of state repression adds credence to the charge that the process by which statehood was achieved violated UN provisions in Resolution 742. Because Hawaii was on the list of UN list of non-self-governing territories, the United States had a sacred trust obligation to afford the people of Hawaii several possibilities, including independence and Commonwealth status, The federal ballot used in 1959 only offered immediate statehood or territorial governance, which violates UN provisions. A 1959 public service announcement starring Governor William Quinn declared, quote, Hawaiian Paradise is a business, an investment for every citizen, which does and must continue to return multi-million-dollar profits in paradise. These profits, in turn, create a better way of life for our people. And so 3 years after Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state, on May 7th, 1962, the headline of the Honolulu Advertiser read that the Sheraton Corporation was being offered $34 million for 4 of its properties in Waikiki. Having just purchased these hotels 3 years earlier, this offer would have doubled their investment. A $5 million offer was later sent to George Murphy for his ranch on the island of Molokai, 17 times more than he paid 7 years earlier. The next day, the morning paper reported that $9 million had been offered for the entire valley of Makaha, and $1.2 million was offered for the ownership of the Waianae Development Company owned by Chin Ho. So Chin Ho, as many of you know, was a major land developer and is said to be one of the first Asian American self-made millionaires. He's also, there's that one character, Ho Chin, in Hawaii Five-0. That guy is actually named after this land developer. So Ho stated in response to the multi-million-dollar offers, quote, if they put the money on the line Tuesday, we will sell. Everything has its price, and we're in business to please our stockholders. And so within 5 days of the first initial offer, there were a total of 7 offers totaling $62 million. And all who received these offers were in negotiations to accept. And so the economic miracle promised by Hawaii's 25-year state-led movement for admission as a U.S. state was seemingly coming to fruition. Receiving local, national, and international media coverage, so like the New York Times covers it, the Wall Street Journal covers this. The press conferences featured a man named D. Franklin Carson, who is said to be the representative of the Switzerland-based International Trade Exchange Central that was seeking to purchase these properties. While many were in the dark about the identity of the investors, after the paper made mention of Samia Malu's possible involvement, those who knew of Omalu already concluded that the whole thing was a prank. Carson stated to the press that Omalu had no connection to the deal and that the, quote, wealth joined with that of his son, left to them both by the late Princess Maria, is sufficient for him to have accomplished this entire transaction without need of recourse to any of my principals. So for those in the know, this statement, which was printed on the front page of the newspapers, revealed the punchline. Omalu was never married to a Princess Maria, nor did he have a son, and Omalu's occupation as a Hawaiian genealogical columnist meant he did not have the means to afford these properties. But those really in the know knew that Omalu was gay. And furthermore, Omalu was known in the Hawaiian community to pull off elaborate performance pranks. To name a few, after enlisting into the U.S. Army as a private during World War II, he was soon found walking the military base wearing an officer's uniform and getting saluted. He was eventually dismissed through a medical discharge on homosexuality, which he denied. In San Francisco, he posed as an Indian Maharaja, demanding and then receiving a room in the Mark Hopkins Hotel. In Japan, he held a press conference as the Prince of Hawaii while wearing a cape. A radio personality named Hal Lewis, popularly known as Aku, said, quote, take the Sheraton deal in 1962. I knew almost immediately what was happening. I knew about Sammy and I loved it. And so the childhood friend and attorney of Omalu's investment group, Harold Schnack, stated that he supported Omalu because he spoke of the need to assist, quote, Hawaiian people attaining their rightful place in our community, the selection of lands of particular significance to persons of Hawaiian ancestry, the benevolent plans for caring for and employing Hawaiians and providing scholarships for their children, together with the apparent availability of Swiss funds, made this a project worth encouraging even if it should fail to materialize. As opposed to Chin Ho, Omalu planned to keep Makaha Valley, quote, undeveloped as sacred ground. The Molokai Ranch property is owned by George Murphy, where Omalu stated his ancestors were buried. Murphy, who bought his ranch and an area originally promised to Kanakawiwi on the island of Molokai from Bishop Estates in 1955, was notorious for building roads and subdivisions along sacred hillsides and inserting galvanized lead pipes into sacred pools above Mo'ula Falls. While many on Molokai fought Murphy, believing that he was out to develop the sacred valley and, quote, commercially cover its ancient roots, he began leasing the land and replacing native families with settler tenants. Furthermore, Sheraton properties that were said to be purchased by Amalu all referred to Hawaiian royalty. Lee Carson spoke about Amalu hoping to, quote, make the Makaha Ranch one of the biggest in the world. All poultry and dairy products for Hawaii would come from the ranch instead of being imported. In this way, Amalu conveyed Hawaiian possibilities for the use of land not as property from which to accumulate profit, but as aina, as that which feeds, an alternative future that has profound resonance with current ongoing land and water struggles for foodways and economies in Hawaii and other parts of the world. So Amalu's hoax ended as he was arrested in Seattle at the airport en route to New York to apparently close a deal on a warrant for 2 bad checks, one in San Francisco where he pretended to be an Indian Maharaja at the Mark Hopkins Hotel. And soon after his arrest, Amalu stated in an interview from Folsom Prison, which is a federal prison. He stated, quote, that he was thinking of challenging the United States' right to Hawaii, the 50th state, and taking all the land back again. And so in a rare moment, a decade after being released from federal prison, Amalu revisited his $1 million hoax in his Honolulu Advertiser column. He had a column in the Honolulu Advertiser, for those of you who don't even know. He stated, quote, I somehow became associated with the likes of the Sheraton people, with Chin Ho, and with a chap from the wilds of Molokai named George Murphy. Tycoons all and absolutely filthy with lucre. I had to look up the word lucre. It means like money that you got immorally. And if there be any among you who cannot recall this particular association, read no further, nor chance the thought for one single moment that I'm going to explain anything. Only twice in my life did I ever try to explain anything, and each time I landed in jail. And so turning the silent fears of statehood into a joke, Amalu offered new possibilities by exposing his contempt for the conditions of occupation and capitalism, at the same time that he masterfully reconstituted Hawaii as a particularly kanapauiwi place. So I'd like to just end by sharing a story about the photograph that I used for the cover of the book, and it's also the image that was in the flyer for tonight's event. Right? And so it's sort of fitting because many of the people who are gathered here tonight were a part of this action. And this was in 2009, on the 50th anniversary of Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state. And this photo was taken from inside the Hawaii State Capitol, looking up through the open-air rotunda, flowing red and black banners that read Hawaiian independence, wave in the wind in the foreground, and are juxtaposed with 2 military fighter jets doing an aerial fly over the Capitol building in the background. And this is a photo that's taken by John Chichiro, and George Flores also has another photo that a lot of people are using. So when the 50th anniversary of U.S. statehood was celebrated in 2009, the United States was in another major economic crisis. The global financial crisis, a Great Recession, they called it the Great Recession, in 2009 led then Governor Linda Lingle and Attorney General Mark Bennett to successfully appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court to gain the ability to sell or transfer 1.2 million acres of so-called ceded lands. And such forms of settler accumulation by native dispossession, the state of Hawaii attempting to sell or transfer these contested lands to make up for a governmental deficit, took place alongside an ongoing U.S. war on terror. And so in 2008, a newly elected Barack Obama, born and raised in Honolulu, offered a softer, liberal form of U.S. imperial aggression, not unlike Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state offered the Cold War in 1959. So on March 18, 2009, the day this photograph was taken, it commemorated the signing of the Admission Act, and the Hawaiian Independence Action Alliance, the HIAA, had organized an action to counter the state's celebration of itself. And at the time of the action, I was a graduate student finishing my dissertation on Hawaii's admission as U.S. state and actively organizing with the HIAA. So throughout 2009, we organized marches and public art actions, produced or participated in television shows, radio shows, and public talks, held film screenings and community events, and provided other spaces for public dialogue about Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state. Our group aimed to create an alternative message by using alternative media forms, and unlike the Statehood Commission, which had a $600,000 budget to commemorate U.S. statehood, the HIAA was a strictly grassroots effort with no financial support. Anticipating such actions, the state of Hawaii ruled that no signs would be allowed inside the open-air Capitol building, and the group planned accordingly And each participant, and this is the idea of Lynette, this is Lynette's idea. Each group planned accordingly, and each participant, Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian, and across different generations, wore a black shirt with a single bright green letter to collectively spell out the phrases fake state and history of theft. The key point person, longtime organizer Lynette Cruz, argued to the press, quote, "There was no treaty of annexation. Show me the treaty. There's been an incorrect interpretation of history all these years." Although the local newspapers and news channels limited their coverage of the demonstration to a brief mention, coverage by the Associated Press provided the group with national and international attention. The late Hawaiian nationalist Richard Pomaikini, who was 19 years old at the time was stated, is quoted as saying, quote, "Statehood is a fraud. My parents in Hawaii would become only a place for the wealthy. Look at it today. There's nothing to celebrate." In the planning of the March 2009 action, Lynette asked me to carry the banners that read Hawaiian independence into the Capitol building, saying she would take photos of the moment when security attempted to stop me from entering. As a security guard confronted me, I tried my best to create a useful photo op, but because he was older than me, it felt disrespectful to argue with him, and we just ended up talking story. He eventually let me through, and as I looked toward Lynette to see if she had gotten a good photo, she simply laughed. And as the action continued, Kekuni Blaisdell, who, as we all know, passed in 2016, Johanna Almiron, who teaches Black Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Lorenz Gonstror, whose dissertation looked at Hawaii's nationhood as a pan-Pacific formation, Terry Keko'olani, and there's a just-released book that highlights anti-terrorist activism, edited by Noelani Guidukauapua, titled Nava Hinekoa, Hawaiian Women for Sovereignty Demilitarization. And this is my partner, Hejin Lee. And they held each other's hands as they moved directly in front of the U.S. Pacific Fleet Band, interrupting their performance of U.S. naval songs to spell the word theft. The HIA group moved together to Beretania Street, where we held our signs. But as we moved back into the Capitol building, the uncle who was working security stopped me and spoke softly in Pidgin. "If you like one good picture, put your banners in the rotunda when the jets fly over." And so he told me what time the flyover was supposed to start. And I notified artist and media activist Jonathan Shishido's photo of the moment is featured. And so it was thanks to the security guards' astute and creative imagination that we were able to get the photograph with the words Hawaiian Independence on the front page of the morning paper of the 50th anniversary of Hawaii statehood, and is thus archived in the official historical record. And what is awesome. I actually like this photo better. And so what's haunting to me about this photograph is that the constraining logics of the settler state literally frames the photo. And while the violent nature of empire via its military jets are in the background, Hawaiian independence is figured not only in words, but also in a particular form that illustrates how this independence precedes, but also exceeds the political possibilities of the United States. And so Donna Burns, the prolific Kanaka Uiwi artist who created the banners, and so if you know her, or if you don't know her, you'd be familiar with her design of the Locomotion Hawaii logo. So she designed the banners. She conceived of the independence banners to look like the symbol of Lono, a major deity of peace, agriculture, rainfall, and fertility. And so military fighter jets designed to resolve political issues with warfare are juxtaposed against a notion of political sovereignty expressed in sacred form tied to life, farming, and peace. Such ways of conceptualizing Hawaiian independence are beyond the political imagination of Western and settler sovereignty, and instead aims for the flourishing of the conditions of life, the very thing that the permanent conditions of warfare, rampant capitalist development, and their progeny climate crisis can destroy. As Kumuhula Olana'ai is often quoted as saying, quote, "Aloha is the intelligence with which we meet life." And so when we recognize that empire relies on imperialist expansion to respond to the failures of capitalism, we can also identify such problems as possibilities for replacement. Hawaiian demonstrations challenging statehood also challenge the state's narration of itself, and in doing so, illuminates how the state's present power was taken historically by illegal force. What the settler state has done with this power is revealed in the present and possibly future realities of rising sea levels, environmental degradation, increased militarism, and growing social and economic discord. Hawaii and its diverse people are tied to a long tradition of resistance to all manners of oppression across many sites of U.S. empire. And so the book that I wrote is an incomplete rendering of a small piece of this resistance. Thank you so much.
Take questions. I'm going to end.